Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside your beautiful ranch, and realizing you're trapped inside your own property. Not because of wild animals, not because of storm, but because a group of neighbors decided to put a fence around your land and didn't give you a way out. That's exactly what happened to one black ranch owner in Texas. His only crime? Owning land that his wealthy neighbors and their homeowners association, HOA, didn't think he deserved. For years, they had tried everything to push him out. Harassing calls, frivolous lawsuits, even calling the cops on him for simply working on his own property. But when they took a step further by fencing him in, they didn't expect his response. One so bold and clever that it would become legendary. Hashtag the fence that crossed the line. The rancher, who will call James Carter to protect his privacy, had owned his 50-acre property for over a decade. He raised cattle, grew crops, and lived peacefully until a new upscale development moved in next door. Almost immediately, the HOA began targeting him. They claimed his livestock was a nuisance, that his land was an eyesore, and that he was lowering property values. Then, one morning, James woke up to find a tall, metal fence encircling his entire property, with no gate. His truck was blocked in. His cattle couldn't graze. He was literally imprisoned on his own land. When he confronted the HOA, they smugly informed him that the fence was built just inside their property line. Technically legal, but clearly a malicious act. They thought they had one. They thought he would sell in frustration. They were wrong. Hashtag the genius countermove. James didn't panic. He didn't beg. Instead, he called a lawyer and then a construction crew. His legal team confirmed that while the fence was on the HOA side, they had violated county easement laws by blocking his only access road. But James didn't stop there. He had a plan. The next day, heavy machinery rolled in. James began construction on a private road, right through the middle of his property, leading to the opposite side, where he connected to a public county road. The catch? To build it, he had to demolish a small corner of his land that bordered the HOA's prized community park. Suddenly, the quiet, picturesque neighborhood was filled with the roar of bulldozers and dump trucks. Dust clouds drifted over the HOA's manicured lawns. The once perfect view now featured a freshly paved road, and James' cattle occasionally strolling past their backyards. Hashtag the HOA's humiliating backpedal. Within days, the HOA was in chaos. Homeowners complained about the noise, the smell, and the unsightly road. Property values actually started dropping. The local news picked up the story, painting the HOA as bullies who had provoked their own downfall. Desperate, the HOA president called James, offering to remove the fence if he stopped construction. But James wasn't done. He demanded more. A formal apology, a public statement admitting their harassment, and a written guarantee that they would never interfere with his land again. They agreed. Hashtag the lesson they'll never forget. James' story spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of resilience against systemic harassment. He didn't just win. He exposed the HOA's cruelty and turned their own game against them. Today, his ranch thrives. The fence is gone. And the HOA? They think twice before targeting anyone else. Because James Carter proved that when you try to cage a man who knows his rights, he won't just break free. He'll build his own path. And you won't like where it leads. In a quiet, upscale suburban community where manicured lawns stretched for miles and every house looked eerily identical, the local homeowners association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist. They dictated everything. The shade of your shutters, the type of flowers in your garden, even how often you had to mow your lawn. But there was one property they couldn't control, a sprawling, generations-old ranch that stood defiantly on the edge of their perfectly planned neighborhood. The ranch had belonged to the same black family for decades, passed down from father to son, a symbol of resilience and independence. While the HOA members obsessed over uniformity, the rancher, let's call him Marcus Johnson, lived by his own rules. His land was alive with the sounds of cattle, the rustle of untamed grass, and the kind of freedom that made his neighbors secretly envious. And that's why they hated it. Hashtag the HOA's war on the ranch. At first, the HOA tried the usual tactics. They sent Marcus endless violation notices, claiming his livestock was too loud, his grass too tall, his fences too rustic. Each time, Marcus fought back, proving his property was exempt from their jurisdiction. But the more he stood his ground, the angrier they became. Then they escalated. One morning, Marcus woke up to the sound of construction. He stepped outside to find crews erecting a massive, wrought iron fence, not just around the HOA's property, but encircling his entire ranch, cutting off every access road. The fence was imposing, nearly 10 feet tall, with spikes at the top like something out of a medieval fortress. And there was only one gate, locked with the HOA holding the key. They had effectively imprisoned him on his own land. Hashtag the ultimate power play. The message was clear. You don't belong here. The HOA thought they had one. Without access to the main roads, Marcus couldn't transport his cattle, receive deliveries, or even leave his property without their permission. They assumed he'd either surrender or sell. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to beg for his freedom. He was the kind of man who built his own dam door. Hashtag the legendary counterattack. Marcus called his lawyer, who immediately filed a lawsuit for illegal land blockade. But Marcus didn't stop there. While the legal battle raged, he hired a construction crew of his own. Instead of fighting for the right to use the HOA's roads, he created his own. Using an old family easement buried in county records, Marcus bulldozed a private road straight through his property, connecting to a public highway on the opposite side. The catch? The shortest route cut right along the border of the HOA's prized community park, a serene, picture-perfect space where residents held yoga classes and birthday parties. Overnight, the HOA's peaceful oasis turned into a construction zone. The roar of heavy machinery drowned out their meditation sessions. Dust clouds drifted over their organic gardens. And worst of all, Marcus's cattle now had a front row seat to their outrage, grazing lazily along the new road as HOA members fumed. Hashtag the HOA's humiliating defeat. Within weeks, the HOA was in chaos. Homeowners demanded action, but Marcus's road was perfectly legal. Property values near the construction site plummeted. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting the HOA as petty tyrants who had bullied the wrong man. Finally, the HOA caved. They offered to remove the fence if Marcus halted construction. But Marcus, now holding all the leverage, made his own demands. 1. A public apology posted in the HOA newsletter and local paper. 2. A permanent easement agreement guaranteeing unrestricted access to his land. 3. A donation to a black land preservation fund to ensure their harassment had at least one positive outcome. Defeated, the HOA agreed. Hashtag the aftermath, a lesson in power. Today, Marcus's ranch stands stronger than ever. The fence is gone, his cattle roam freely, and his private road remains, a permanent middle finger to anyone who thinks they can cage a man on his own land. As for the HOA, they still enforce their petty rules, but they've learned one hard lesson. Some fences are meant to keep people out. Others? They just show the world who's really trapped inside. At first, the rancher, let's call him Elijah Carter, saw red. The audacity of these people, fencing him in on land that had been in his family since his great-grandfather's time. He called the HOA president daily, demanding answers. He sent certified letters threatening legal action. He even showed up at their monthly meetings, where smug homeowners in pastel polos would shrug and say the fence was for community safety and neighborhood aesthetics. But Elijah knew the truth. This was psychological warfare. They wanted to grind him down, make it so inconvenient, so humiliating to live on his own land that he'd finally cave and sell. And why? Because his 200-acre ranch, with its weathered barns and roaming cattle, didn't fit their sanitized suburban fantasy. Because a successful black landowner made them uneasy. Because they could. Hashtag the breaking point. For weeks, Elijah lived like a prisoner. Groceries had to be hauled in on foot. His cattle couldn't reach grazing pastures. Vet visits for his livestock became logistical nightmares. The HOA watched his struggles with barely concealed glee, certain their plan was working. But Elijah had survived worse. He'd fought for respect his whole life, in school, in business, even just driving through towns like this one. He wasn't about to let a bunch of entitled neighbors steal what his ancestors had built. So he started digging. Late nights at the county clerk's office, poring over land deeds and surveying maps, looking for any weakness in the HOA scheme. Then, buried in a dusty property record from 1972, he found it. Hashtag the $50,000 masterstroke. The strip of land where the HOA had installed their control gate, the only entry point they'd allowed, wasn't actually theirs. It belonged to a reclusive, elderly widow who'd refused to sell when the development was built. The HOA had assumed they could bully her into compliance later, but they'd forgotten about her. And now, at 89 years old, she was finally willing to sell. Elijah moved fast. He offered cash. He shared his story. And when the widow, a feisty former schoolteacher who'd spent decades fighting developers, heard how the HOA was using her land to harass him, she sold it to him for $1. Overnight, the power dynamic flipped. The gate that had been the HOA's instrument of control now belonged to Elijah. And he had plans for it. Hashtag poetic justice, one lock at a time. The first notice came via community email blast at 6 a.m. on a Monday. Asterisk, due to safety concerns, unauthorized access through the south gate will be restricted effective immediately. Keyholders must submit to a background check and attend an orientation. Processing time, 4 to 6 weeks. Asterisk, it was word for word the same bureaucratic nonsense the HOA had used on him. Chaos erupted. Lawn crews couldn't get in. Pool maintenance trucks idled outside. A Tesla owner actually had to walk 300 yards to his house after the valet parking service was denied entry. The HOA board demanded Elijah remove the lock. He invited them to sue, knowing they'd lose since he now held the deed. They threatened to fine him. He laughed and doubled the gate's security deposit fee. When they sent their lawyer, Elijah's response went viral. Asterisk, you build a fence to keep me in. Now you're mad because it's keeping you out? Funny how that works. Asterisk, hashtag the surrender. After 2 weeks of garbage piling up and landscapers revolting, the HOA caved. They offered to remove the entire fence if Elijah would restore gate access. But he'd learned from their playbook. He made them sweat. He demanded 1. A public apology, read aloud at their next meeting and published in the local paper. 2. A binding covenant, barring the HOA from ever interfering with his property rights. 3. A scholarship fund for black agriculture students at the local community college. They agreed to everything. Hashtag the new normal. Today, the fence is gone. The gate remains, but now it's decorated with a hand-painted sign Elijah commissioned. Asterisk private property. Trespassers will be tolerated, but not respected. Asterisk his cattle graze peacefully as HOA members drive by, their faces tight with resentment. Sometimes at night, Elijah sits on his porch with the old widow, now a frequent dinner guest, and they laugh about the time a bunch of arrogant homeowners forgot the first rule of power struggles. Before you build a fence around someone else's life, make sure you own the gate. When the HOA board members first realized what had happened, that the rancher now controlled their gate, their reaction was nothing short of explosive. The president's face turned beet red during an emergency meeting, sputtering about blatant extortion and violating community trust. Lawyers were called. Angry letters drafted. But when their legal team reviewed the property records, the truth was undeniable. The rancher owned the land, the gate, and every inch of the access road leading to it. The HOA had built their own prison. Hashtag the sweet taste of revenge. At first, the HOA tried brute force. They sent workers to cut the lock. Elijah simply installed a heavier one with cameras. They threatened to fine him for disrupting community operations. He responded by invoicing them for unauthorized use of private property. When they parked cars to block his cattle trailers, he had them towed at the HOA's expense. Then came his masterstroke, the toll system. Elijah drafted a formal access agreement, modeled after the HOA's own petty bylaws, listing strict terms. $500/month for a gate key per vehicle. $75 processing fee for each new key holder. $150/hour for after-hours emergency access. When the HOA refused to pay, he padlocked the gate completely. Suddenly, their landscapers couldn't service half the neighborhood. Pool maintenance trucks had to take a 12-mile detour. A resident's wedding caterers arrived late when their van got stuck outside. The community erupted, but not at Elijah. Their fury turned toward the HOA board. #, the revolt begins. Homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions at meetings. Asterisk. Why are we paying $400 per month in dues if you idiots don't even know where our property lines are? Asterisk. You spent $80,000 on a fence to harass one man, and now we have to pay him. Asterisk. Local news picked up the story, painting the HOA as vindictive fools. A viral TikTok showed Elijah calmly sipping sweet tea in a lawn chair beside his gate, waving at fuming Tesla drivers forced to take the long way home. The caption, asterisk, HOA, $0. Me, $5,000 this month. God is good. Asterisk. Hashtag the HOA's humiliating surrender. After 3 weeks of chaos, the board caved. They agreed to 1. Remove the entire fence at their own expense. 2. Pay Elijah $25,000 in retroactive access fees. 3. Publicly apologize in the community newsletter. But Elijah had one final condition. The HOA president had to personally deliver the check, wearing a t-shirt that read asterisk, I tried to steal a man's land, and all I got was this lousy shirt. The president resigned instead. Elijah framed the rejection letter. Hashtag the aftermath, a legacy of resistance. Today, the fence is scrap metal. The gate remains, now decorated with cattle brands and a sign reading asterisk, trespassers will be compensated at $300 per hour. Asterisk. More importantly, the incident sparked real change. HOA membership dropped 40% as residents questioned its purpose. New state laws now limit HOA's ability to harass non-member properties. Elijah's story is taught in property law courses as a case study in creative justice. As for Elijah, he used the settlement money to drill a water well, ensuring his ranch's independence forever. Sometimes at night, you'll find him at that fateful gate, grilling burgers for neighbors who finally see him as what he always was. Not an outsider, not a nuisance, the man who owns the road. This story cuts deeper than a simple property dispute. It's a modern-day parable about power, persistence, and the quiet revolution of self-respect. When that rancher woke up to find himself fenced in by his own neighbors, he faced a choice we all recognize: submit to unfairness or fight back in a way they'd never forget. His victory wasn't just personal. It became a beacon for anyone who's ever felt outnumbered, outgunned, or trapped by systems designed to keep them in their place. Hashtag the deeper battle beneath the fence. What made the HOA's actions so insidious wasn't just the physical barrier. It was the arrogance behind it. They never expected him to fight back because people like him weren't supposed to win against people like them. HOAs, corporations, bureaucracies, they all rely on the same assumption, that most people will eventually tire out, give in, or decide it's not worth the trouble. But this rancher understood something fundamental. The real fence wasn't made of metal. It was made of their expectations. And the moment he refused to play by their rules, their entire strategy collapsed. His story exposes the secret weakness of every bully. They're terrible at improvising when their victim stops acting like one. Hashtag the anatomy of a perfect counterattack. Let's break down why his strategy worked so brilliantly. 1. He played the long game. While the HOA assumed he'd react emotionally, he methodically researched property records. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment revenge. It was a calculated strike at their weakest point. 2. He used their weapons against them. By mirroring their tactics, fees, paperwork, bureaucratic delays, he highlighted how absurd their power trip had been. Suddenly, they were the ones drowning in red tape they'd created. 3. He controlled the narrative. The viral videos and news stories didn't just embarrass the HOA. They reframed the entire conflict. No longer a disgruntled landowner, he became the sympathetic underdog outsmarting the villains. 4. He made them pay, literally. The financial toll transformed the conflict from an ideological fight to a bottom-line issue. When other homeowners saw their dues being wasted, the HOA's support crumbled. Hashtag why this story resonates so deeply. This isn't just about property rights. It's about every time someone has tried to silence you with rules they don't follow themselves, make you feel small for not conforming, use paperwork and procedures as weapons. We cheer for the rancher because we've all faced versions of that fence. The employer who thinks you'll tolerate disrespect. The system designed to make giving up easier than fighting. The people who mistake kindness for weakness. His victory matters because it proves the underdog's greatest advantage *, while bullies rely on scripts, free thinkers can rewrite the story entirely. Hashtag the ripple effects of resistance. The aftermath reveals the true impact of his stand. Psychological shift *, neighbors who once avoided him now bring pies and ask for cattle raising advice. Structural change *, new state laws protect landowners from similar harassment. Cultural impact *, his story is shared in law schools and community forums as a case study in ethical resistance. Most importantly, he didn't just win. He redefined winning. Instead of leaving their goal, he made his ranch more valuable and independent than ever. Hashtag your fence is waiting. We all face these moments, maybe not with HOAs, but with toxic workplaces that mistake compliance for loyalty, social circles that police conformity, systems that reward keeping your head down. The lesson isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation. When someone tries to fence you in, 1. Find the leverage they forgot about, like that sliver of land. 2. Stay calm while they panic. Their frustration is your fuel. 3. Make the cost of oppressing you higher than leaving you alone. That rancher isn't just some guy who beat an HOA. He's proof that the most powerful response to know your place will always be, make me, and then charging them for the privilege of watching you thrive.